All right, welcome to the final episode of Lipids. Last time we talked about ketogenic dieting and general body composition, but one of the things about ketogenic dieting that a lot of people attack is, can it work in athletes? Let's get into it. We're going to talk about ketogenic dieting and endurance training, as well as ketogenic dieting and untrained resistance trained people and resistance trained people. So, have you heard the saying, a runner hits the wall? What does it mean to hit a wall? What it means is that an athlete is carbohydrate adapted, meaning their main fuel is carbohydrate. And when they run out of carbohydrate, they hit a wall. And yet, that endurance athlete has within him or her an endless supply, a nearly unlimited supply of fuel. And that fuel is fat. And so an endurance runner hitting a wall is like a fuel tanker running out of fuel. And that's a real good analogy that Jeff VOLEK made. Why is this the case? Well, we hit a wall when we run out of glycogen, okay? But if you look at your glycogen tank, that is like 2,000 calories. Whereas if you look at our fat tank, that's great. That's greater than 40,000 calories, even in your leanest individual. Okay? So that's literally a virtually endless supply of fuel. The question is how we tap into it. The answer is keto adaptation. So we have all this buildup, adipose tissue in our body, but endurance athletes can't use it efficiently. Okay? So unless they're keto adapted. And keto adaptation is essentially when your body's adapted to use ketones as its main source of fuel. So first study that looked at ketogenic dieting in athletes was by Finney, a couple decades ago. They used highly trained cyclists who normally consumed a very high carbohydrate diet, and they switched to a very low carbohydrate diet for 4 weeks. Greater than 80% of their diet was fat. They had less than 10 grams of carbohydrate and moderate protein. So what you're looking at here is after adapting to a very low carbohydrate diet. You notice that performance time, what they did was they did a time to exhaustion trial at a moderate intensity, meaning how long they could go before they were exhausted at a given intensity. And notice that the high carbohydrate group and the ketogenic diet group went as long. There were no differences between conditions. So this suggests that it could be used for long duration events. Now, let's talk about fat oxidation. Why are these athletes able to do this with no carbs? Well, they shift their fuel utilization to use primarily fat. So what you're seeing here, Venables in 2005 basically took non-keto adapted people who were primarily using carbs, and looked at how much fat they could use per hour. The lowest participant only used 11 grams of fat per hour, and the highest was 60. Okay? But if you look at the ketogenic group, the lowest participant was using 74 grams of fat per hour. Contrast that with the highest participant, which was 60 grams per hour. The highest participant in the study used 112 grams per hour. So that is clear sign of keto adaptation. But one of the things to realize, a lot of studies will do short-term studies, and in their short-term studies, what they'll essentially do is put people on a ketogenic diet for a week, and their performance declines. Well, that would make sense because they're not keto adapted. So this is a 6-week study with Finney again in 83, and you look at pre-time to exhaustion, 1 week after ketogenic dieting, performance goes down, and then it goes up by 6 weeks. So if you're testing the impact of ketogenic dieting over a week's time, that window might be too narrow. So what we have here is what the question is: what happens with high intensity endurance? Okay, so that's essentially what this study tested. What they did was they took a group. They had a high carbohydrate group where 70% of their diet was carbs. They had a high fat group in which 70% of their diet was from fat. So what you see is they did a 100-kilometer time trial day 1. Then day 3 they did 60 minutes steady state, 65% VO2 max. Day 5, 60 minutes steady state. Day 7, 60 minutes steady state. And then both groups carb loaded at 8 to 10 grams of carbs per kilogram. Then at day 8 they did the time trial again. Okay, so again, time trial before, a week or almost a week of low carb dieting, a carb up, and then a high intensity bout. I want you to look at, this is even after carbing up. They looked at the day of that time trial at fat metabolism. Okay, and you see that this right here is the high fat diet. Notice their RER, which is respiratory exchange ratio, is lower. The lower respiratory exchange ratio is, the closer it is to 0.7, the more fat you are metabolizing. So clearly these people were fat adapted. Now as far as time on the 100-kilometer time trial, there was no statistical difference between groups. But 100 kilometers is a long, long race. What I want you to notice here is what happened to power output. Okay, so what you're seeing in the black, okay, the black squares are the high fat group, the high fat diet that switched to CHO, and then the triangles are the high carb that loaded on CHO. And as you notice that on a 1 kilometer sprint, the high carb was better than the high fat. That's because carbs are the preferred fuel source for high intensity exercise. However, it is important to realize that, again, this was a 1-week study. But based on this, probably it may not be beneficial to be keto adapted for high intensity exercise. But we're going to get into that more a little bit in a second. Now, what's going on is that if you look at pyruvate dehydrogenase activity, which is rate limiting to move substrate from glycolysis to the Krebs cycle, pyruvate dehydrogenase in the black group is lower than the gray group, which is the high carb. Black group is the high fat group. So it seems to blunt the use of carbs as fuel. But again, these are only 6 days in duration, and so we do know that ketogenic dieting is fine for long duration endurance exercise, but at high intensity sprinting, endurance performance could be impaired. We'll get more to that in a bit. All right, what about resistance training? Well, Jeff VOLEK, the world's leading authority on ketogenic dieting, basically took overweight men and he put them on a ketogenic diet. So there were 4 conditions in this study. He had a low-fat sedentary group, a low-carb sedentary group, a low-fat plus resistance training group, and of course a low-fat high-carb, and a low-carb plus resistance training group. So we can look across the spectrum what happened. This is percent change in body fat. The low-fat lost 2%. Low-fat sedentary. The low-carb lost 3.4%. The low-fat plus resistance training lost 3.5%. So low-fat plus resistance training was no better at losing fat than low-carb alone. And then low-carb plus resistance training lost the most fat. So it seems to be beneficial in sedentary overweight populations. However, it wasn't until recently where we really start looking at this in high-intensity athletes. over a longer period than a week. Paoli actually collaborated on this study with Dr. Dominique D'Agostino at a USF, and they compared a traditional, very low-carb ketogenic diet versus traditional carbohydrate diet and 8 elite gymnasts over 30 days' time. So these researchers examined body composition as well as strength and performance tests. So again, what happened is they tested them before. Then for 30 days they did their normal routine, but it was on a ketogenic diet. Okay, and basically look at body weight. The very low carb ketogenic diet lost body weight, whereas the Western diet maintained their body weight. Body fat went down in the very low carb ketogenic diet and stayed the same in the Western diet. What was cool is that there are no differences detected in all strength measures. So it seemed to be a valid way to lose body fat. 4.2 pounds, in fact. Also, there were no change in lean mass. But again, some of the limitations, this wasn't a controlled training program. They just said, just do what you normally do. Only 30 days in length, and it was a small sample size. But it led us to think that, hey, maybe we could look at this. Maybe it's not as detrimental as we think. Now, here's some possible downfalls to ketogenic dieting. Okay, one thing we know is that lactic acid is not as high when performing high-intensity exercise in a ketogenic state. Okay? And the reason why is because we have what are called monocarboxylic acid transporters. Monocarboxylic acid transporters. If you're interested in this, George Brooks out of UC Berkeley has done the most research on this. Basically, these take up both ketones and lactate, and when ketones are high, these transporters are upregulated. So, of course, because you have less glycogen, you're going to produce less lactate, plus you can clear it faster with the MCT transporter. So the point, though, is this. We know metabolic stress is important for growth. We also know metabolic stress increases the cell swelling response. So this leads people to believe that, oh, well, wait a second, maybe you can't gain as much muscle on this. So our lab decided to put this to the test. So before I start this, I want to give a shout out to all the guys in our lab who did this: Ryan Lowry, Jacob Orms, Jeremy Silva, Jacob Roush, Kevin Shields, Sean McCleary, Matt Sharp. All these guys ran this study in our lab, and we took 30 subjects. 15 were put on a ketogenic diet, and 15 were non-Western. They trained every body part 3 times a week in a periodized fashion for 8 weeks. Before they started the study, we keto adapted them for 2 weeks. So they entered into the study keto adapted. So here's what happened with lean body mass, okay? So if you look from week 0 to 8, it appears that basically the keto group is the gray group, and the arrow I just pointed to is the Western group, which is the green group. So from week 0 to 8, you can see that the Western group went up more in lean mass, right? So you conclude that basically, okay, well, ketogenic diet, you can gain muscle, but not as much muscle. However, one thing I want to point out is that week 0, we measured that I'm in a carbohydrate adequate state, whereas at week 8, they were in a carbohydrate depleted state. Now we know carbohydrates draw about 3 grams of water per gram into the muscle. So that's going to affect the overall size of the muscle. Yet they gained muscle despite the fact that they were quote-unquote flat. So for 1 week, we loaded them on carbohydrates. And if you look at week 9, the lean mass went up from week 8 to 9 and stayed in the keto group, but stayed the same in the Western. This is because the keto group's lean mass, all their muscle filled out with glycogen, revealing the gains they had actually made. So by this results, we can conclude that ketogenic dieting can be beneficial for gaining muscle mass, at least as beneficial as Western. If you look at fat mass here, the ketogenic diet group basically went from here to here, from week 0 to 8, and the carb group went from there to there. However, so when on ketogenic dieting, you are losing more body fat, but the ketogenic gained some fat back by week 9. And so their fat loss wasn't different than the Western by week 9. By week 8, the delta change, or the net fat loss, if you do a t-test compared to the delta change, pre minus post fat in grams, was greater in the keto than the Western, but not after the 9th week. So reintroduction of carbs seemed to cause them to gain some fat. This is strength gains. This is a squat. Notice strength went up equally in the keto group and the Western group. But here is interesting. What I want you to see is this. Okay, from week 0 to 8, power went down in the keto group, but it went up. You see, it went down in the keto group, but it went up in the Western group. However, in week 9, when you reintroduce carbs, power was reinstated. So this is in contrast to the previous study that we saw with the 100-kilometer race. At least instantaneous power was not inhibited once carbs were reintroduced. But one of the coolest things we saw is that testosterone went up over 100 points in the ketogenic dieting group. We can see that here. Whereas it stayed the same, or actually visually went down in the Western group. And why? Because testosterone is a lipid, okay? And so what you have is you have more raw substrate for this lipid. So for conclusions, for strength and body composition, ketogenic dieting is as effective as Western for strength training. However, power may be hampered until carbohydrates are reintroduced. Okay, that's the end of the lecture. Thank you for your time. I'll see you next time.